expanding beyond the legal arena, jury nullifications affects ripple through broader society. This part delves into how conscientious acquittals intersect with criminal justice reform, bridging calls for more equitable sentencing and community-driven accountability. We then examine the role of nullification in civil rights issues, highlighting the dual capacity for protecting vulnerable groups or perpetuating prejudice. Finally, we focus on democracy and accountability, where jury decisions mirror public values and can press legislative bodies toward policy shifts. Through these discussions, readers will see how a single verdict resonates beyond the courtroom, shaping public trust, spurring civic engagement, and fosters social progress. Impact on social justice movements. In the previous sections, we examined how jury nullification functions within the legal system, how it is perceived by the public and media, and the ethical questions it provokes. We now turn to its broader societal implications, focusing on how conscientious acquittals influence social justice movements, and, in turn, how those movements shape the conversation around nullification. While this doctrine has historically been most visible in courtroom settings, its resonance often extends far beyond individual trials. It can serve as a catalyst for criminal justice reform, a flashpoint for debates about civil rights, and even a rallying cry for communities seeking to define their collective moral priorities. By exploring these wider repercussions, we gain insight into the ways that jury nullification, employed rarely yet powerfully, can advance or impede social progress. Bridging calls for more equitable sentencing. One of the most significant ways jury nullification intersects with social justice movements is through the realm of sentencing reform. Over the past several decades, the United States and other jurisdictions have witnessed a surge in mandatory minimum laws and rigid sentencing guidelines, especially for drug-related offenses. These measures were initially intended to deter crime and bring uniformity to punishments. However, critics argue that they often result in disproportionately severe penalties, especially for nonviolent or first-time offenders. In this environment, some jurors facing cases where the evidence of guilt is clear nonetheless choose to acquit because they perceive the penalty as unjust. That act of conscientious acquittal functions as a de facto protest against a sentencing structure that offers little room for individualized discretion. Activists pushing for sentencing reform sometimes cite these nullification verdicts as evidence that the community does not support laws that impose harsh punishments regardless of context. Each high-profile acquittal can spark renewed conversations about whether the legislature should reevaluate draconian statutes, thus forging an inadvertent alliance between courtroom outcomes and broader policy advocacy. At the same time, proponents of strict sentencing worry that such acquittals undermine the deterrent effect of the law and create inconsistency. This tension underscores how deeply nullification touches the debate over punishment. It simultaneously reveals community unease with rigid penalties and raises concerns about selectively weakening legal frameworks. Nonetheless, the appearance of nullification in such cases may be the spark that prompts legislatures to contemplate reforms, bridging grassroots calls for mercy with tangible policy changes. Community-driven accountability. Beyond sentencing, jury nullification often intersects with social justice through the lens of community empowerment. Many reform movements emphasize the importance of local voices in defining what constitutes justice and appropriate accountability. When jurors choose to nullify, they effectively assert communal moral standards that diverge from or critique official legislative mandates. In some instances, this communal stance highlights issues such as over-policing, racial profiling, or unjust targeting of vulnerable populations. For example, a grassroots organization in a neighborhood dealing with systematic policing strategies, perhaps frequent stops or arrests for minor infractions, might quietly endorse nullification as a method of rejecting what they see as oppressive law enforcement. If local jurors repeatedly refuse to convict on low-level charges, trespassing, minor drug possession, or loitering, the community is effectively telling lawmakers, "We don't believe these arrests serve the collective interest." Over time, such a pattern can encourage shifts in policing or prosecutorial strategies, nudging authorities toward alternative approaches, diversion programs, community mediation, or the decriminalization of minor offenses. Detractors argue that this form of community-driven accountability risks chaos, as different locales may apply the law unevenly. Yet for many social justice advocates, the capacity for jurors to speak as the moral voice of their neighborhoods is exactly the point. It provides a direct, if limited, mechanism for ordinary citizens to say no to state practices they find harmful, thereby influencing real-world policy from the bottom up. The role of nullification in civil rights issues. Historically, jury nullification has played a key role in civil rights struggles, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. In the era leading up to the Civil War, Northern jurors who believed slavery was immoral occasionally acquitted defendants prosecuted under the Fugitive Slave Act, thus refusing to enforce a law they deemed an affront to human dignity. These acquittals helped galvanize the abolitionist cause and showcased how local moral judgments could clash with federal statutes. Conversely, in the Jim Crow South, white juries regularly nullified by acquitting white defendants who had perpetrated violent acts against black individuals, underscoring how the same mechanism could perpetuate horrific injustices. This duality starkly illustrates the double-edged nature of nullification. It can be a vehicle for resisting oppressive law, but it can also shelter or reinforce entrenched prejudices when the prevailing community values are discriminatory. In modern contexts, civil rights campaigns that focus on systemic racism in policing or the overrepresentation of minority communities in jails sometimes flirt with the idea of nullification. Advocates may propose conscientious acquittals for protesters arrested at civil rights demonstrations, or for individuals charged under laws believed to target minority communities disproportionately. Though such proposals often remain implicit, since openly advising nullification in court can lead to legal repercussions, this undercurrent of resistance is present in many corners of activism. It reflects the enduring temptation to deploy nullification as a swift remedy for deep-seated inequalities, albeit one that can rebound if community prejudices operate in the opposite direction. Dual capacity: protecting vulnerable groups or perpetuating prejudice. From a broader societal perspective, the capacity for jury nullification to protect vulnerable groups is intimately tied to whether the local community views those groups as worthy of defense. In cases where empathy prevails, like a parent stealing food to feed their children or a peaceful protester challenging an unjust ordinance, jurors may elect to acquit despite legal evidence. These decisions can effectively shield marginalized people from statutes that fail to account for nuanced social realities. Yet this same mechanism can perpetuate discrimination. If a community harbors biases against certain groups, racial minorities, immigrants, religious outliers, LGBTQ+ individuals, juries might nullify laws that protect those groups, refusing to convict perpetrators of hate crimes or civil rights violations. The historical record provides examples of hate-based nullification, and while legal reforms and heightened awareness have reduced its visibility, the possibility remains, particularly in areas with stark social or political polarization. Thus, social justice movements often grapple with the fundamental ambiguity of nullification. If harnessed for liberatory ends, it can expedite protection for the vulnerable. If co-opted by bigotry, it can sabotage hard-earned legal protections. Efforts to channel community-driven verdicts toward justice require robust education, activism, and coalition building, ensuring that moral energy in the jury box aligns with inclusive, equitable values. Democracy and accountability. Despite its occasional abuses, jury nullification at times is lauded as a testament to democratic principles. Activists who champion grassroots approaches to governance see nullification as an essential counterbalance to laws that may be enacted without sufficient community input. By placing a final veto power in the hands of ordinary citizens, the system ensures that legislation cannot be enforced blindly if it grossly offends the collective conscience. At a deeper level, this perspective emphasizes accountability. The legislature, prosecutors, and judges must remain aware that jurors, representing the broader public, can check or reject overly punitive or morally contentious statutes. In effect, Nullification acts as a barometer of public sentiment, particularly in cases where official policy lags behind social evolution. For instance, even before marijuana laws were reformed in many states, some juries declined to convict defendants for marijuana possession, reflecting shifting cultural attitudes toward drug use. Their acquittals signaled that the statute no longer matched the community's ethos, thus pressuring legislators to revisit the legal framework. Nevertheless, critics point out that widespread nullification poses the risk of encouraging lawlessness, particularly if communities become overly emboldened to disregard laws they find inconvenient. The tension between democratic empowerment and consistent enforcement remains a central dilemma for social justice advocates seeking to balance the legitimate desire for moral oversight with the rule of law stability. How a single verdict resonates beyond the courtroom. Individual nullification verdicts often reverberate throughout society, taking on symbolic weight disproportionate to the specific case. When a jury conspicuously acquits a defendant believed to have violated a contentious statute, activists and media outlets may seize upon the verdict as a sign of shifting social mores. In some instances, that single outcome generates momentum for petitions, legislative hearings, or protests aimed at revisiting the law in question. Public perception of these cases can evolve quickly. If the acquittal garners praise, it becomes a rallying point, showcasing the power of the people to rectify injustice. If the verdict elicits backlash, opponents may call for stricter measures, narrower jury instructions, more rigorous voir dire, or even legislative crackdowns to ensure the law is upheld. Thus, a single act of nullification can catalyze broader policy debates, highlighting the interplay between a local jury's moral judgment and national conversations about reform. This effect is particularly pronounced when influential media voices or cultural figures amplify the story. Civil rights leaders, celebrities, or prominent activists might publicly commend jurors who acquitted a political protester or a marginalized defendant, imbuing the outcome with a broader narrative about resisting systemic oppression. Even if formal reforms take years or never materialize, the public memory of such verdicts can sustain an ongoing critique of the law's moral underpinnings, shaping public trust in the justice system. Wherever it appears, jury nullification also shapes broader perceptions of the justice system's legitimacy. If communities witness repeated acquittals for laws that seem patently fair, they may question the system's capacity to deliver justice. This skepticism can morph into cynicism, undermining trust in a process meant to adjudicate guilt impartially. On the other hand, if nullification occurs in cases widely viewed as prosecutorial overreach, the justice system might actually gain credibility, with the jury demonstrating a capacity to mitigate legal extremes through common sense. Such fluctuations in public trust also intersect with race, class, and political divides. Minority communities that distrust prosecutors may regard nullification as a positive corrective, while those who champion law and order stances may decry it as subverting the rule of law. Each verdict, whether applauded or derided, ripples through communities, influencing how they perceive prosecutors, judges, lawmakers, and ultimately each other. Spurring civic engagement. A notable byproduct of high-profile nullification cases is the increased civic engagement they can provoke. When an acquittal catalyzes debate, individuals who rarely participate in public life might start attending town halls, volunteering for reform campaigns, or educating themselves about jury service. Activist groups often leverage the publicity surrounding these cases, recruiting new members with a message that ordinary people can make a tangible difference from the jury box. In some circumstances, such mobilization fosters a more informed electorate, better equipped to weigh competing priorities and elect representatives who align with their moral perspectives. In others, the resulting movements can become polarized, with partisans on both sides of the nullification debate using incendiary rhetoric that heightens conflict rather than fostering nuanced discourse. Still, the net effect of conscientious acquittals is often an energized public, newly aware of the justice system's complexities and the potential for citizen-driven change, fostering or frustrating social progress. While jury nullification can be a powerful tool for driving reform, it is far from guaranteed to align with progressive values. The same mechanism that hastens change in oppressive legal regimes can also thwart progressive laws in localities where the majority opposes new protections, whether for environmental regulations, LGBTQ+ rights, or other socially progressive legislation. This tension underscores the fragile balance at work. Nullification is a mirror of popular conscience. If a community's conscience is inclusive and justice-oriented, conscientious acquittals may accelerate social progress. If it is insular or prejudiced, nullification risks impeding the enforcement of rights. Thus, social justice movements seeking to use nullification for liberation must also confront the practice's darker potential. Many activists respond by focusing on education and empathetic coalition building, aiming to broaden the sense of community that jurors carry into deliberations. By cultivating a widespread ethic of inclusivity, solidarity, and fairness, these movements increase the odds that nullification will benefit, rather than harm, marginalized groups. The impact of jury nullification on social justice movements is a testament to both the promise and perils of entrusting citizens with moral oversight of the law. In various historical and contemporary contexts, nullification has functioned as a lever for change, a shield for the oppressed, and an urgent prod to legislators reluctant to adapt outdated statutes. Simultaneously, it has acted as a barricade against progress when fueled by bigotry or local prejudice. Understanding this duality sheds light on why nullification remains a fixture in discussions about participatory democracy and community empowerment. It embodies the tension between structured legal frameworks and the human conscience, between uniform enforcement and local autonomy, between the promise of moral intervention and the threat of arbitrary justice. Ultimately, its broader societal implications underscore that a single jury's verdict can reverberate well beyond the courthouse, resonating with the urgent causes that shape our communal future. In the following part, we will examine how these social currents and legal complexities converge in proposals for reform, exploring potential pathways for bridging moral oversight and consistent rule of law. By evaluating strategies for more transparent jury education, sentencing flexibility, and thoughtful legislative action, we can glean lessons on guiding nullification toward constructive ends, while guarding against its misuse or unintended consequences. Tensions between law and morality. Throughout our examination of jury nullification, its historical emergence, contemporary practice, and role in shaping social justice, we have repeatedly encountered one overarching theme: the tension between codified law and personal morality. This chapter delves deeper into that pivotal conflict, investigating how the doctrine of conscientious acquittal reveals and intensifies the friction between what the law commands on one hand and what conscience insists on the other. By exploring both philosophical underpinnings and real-world ramifications, we illuminate why this issue continues to preoccupy jurors, legal professionals, and the public at large. Ultimately, understanding these tensions better prepares us to consider balanced approaches for integrating moral imperatives into legal structures without undermining the stability and predictability that law is expected to provide. Legal codification versus moral conscience. On paper, laws are statutes enacted through legislative or constitutional mechanisms, meant to guide societal behavior, set standards, and adjudicate disputes. Morality, in contrast, arises from ethical convictions, cultural values, and personal principles about right and wrong. While law and morality often overlap, they do not necessarily coincide. Indeed, history is replete with examples, such as institutionalized slavery or legalized segregation, where the codified law lagged behind or even contradicted widely held moral beliefs. Historical context key. Historical cases illustrate this clash. Juries who acquitted those accused of aiding enslaved individuals prior to the Civil War followed a moral compass that defied federal statutes. Conversely, juries who refused to convict perpetrators of racial violence during Jim Crow twisted the same process of moral choice to perpetuate injustice. In both scenarios, law and morality operated in discordant ways, underscoring how jury verdicts can manifest the gap between what lawmakers command and what communities believe to be ethically defensible. Jury nullification as moral check. Jury nullification springs directly from this tension. It grants individuals brought together as a jury the final say when they perceive the law to be fundamentally misaligned with justice. In doing so, it highlights a persistent question. Should laws always be obeyed simply because they are duly enacted, or must they also satisfy a moral standard to earn the allegiance of conscientious citizens? In some sense, nullification is society's built-in acknowledgement that legislation can be flawed, requiring the possibility of override by the governed. Yet this remedy, in the wrong hands or circumstances, can equally become a tool for moral distortion. Philosophical foundations, natural law and positive law. The tension between law and morality lies at the heart of a centuries-old philosophical debate. Two frameworks in particular, natural law and positive law, provide contrasting views on whether legality and morality should be deeply intertwined. Natural law theory proponents of natural law, e.g., Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, argue that legitimate laws must reflect universal moral principles. If the state enacts a rule that violates these higher ethical standards, such as a law sanctioning torture or discrimination, citizens have the right, or even the duty, to resist. Jury nullification aligns well with this perspective. When jurors find that a statute offends fundamental moral truths, they can morally justify acquitting a defendant to uphold higher law. Positive law theory. Positive law, on the other hand, posits that laws derive their authority from social constructs, legislative procedures, and the state's power to enforce them. Morality, while relevant to shaping policy, is viewed as separate from the question of whether a law must be followed once validly enacted. From a purely positivist stance, a juror's role is to apply statutes as written and not impose personal moral standards. This view tends to marginalize jury nullification, seeing it as an extra-legal or anti-democratic intrusion on uniform law enforcement. In practice, most legal systems occupy a middle ground between these extremes, recognizing the importance of moral reasoning while also insisting on consistency in how laws are applied. Jury nullification serves as an illustration of how neither approach entirely resolve the tension, leaving room for disagreement when morality and legality appear to diverge. Collective conscience versus uniform enforcement. Although modern courts strive for standardized application of laws, local communities often adhere to distinct moral priorities. Jury nullification spotlights these variations, allowing a given jury to express local conscience rather than national or state policy. This interplay can generate both salutary and troubling outcomes, reflecting the broader tension. Localized moral sensibilities. In some cases, a community might deem a particular law unfair, say, punishing low-level drug offenses with lengthy incarceration, and refuse to convict. From the community's vantage point, this refusal honors fairness and proportionate justice. Risk of inconsistent justice. From a broader perspective, however, such localized verdicts can fracture the uniformity of law. Defendants in one county might be acquitted for the same offense that leads to conviction elsewhere, undermining predictability and potentially encouraging forum shopping for favorable jury pools. In short, collective conscience is a powerful force, but it can also undercut the very consistency that legal systems are designed to ensure. The tension reverberates in discussions about whether nullification is an occasional safety valve for unjust statutes or a recurring source of confusion and disparity. Cultural shifts and the evolution of morality. Law does not exist in a vacuum. It evolves in tandem with shifts in cultural values. Jury nullification frequently emerges as an early indicator that public sentiment is veering away from entrenched statutes. Historically, changes in laws regulating alcohol, gambling, sexual conduct, and more recently marijuana use were all foreshadowed by localized verdicts refusing to punish what society no longer regarded as criminal. Catalyst for legal reform. Some observers celebrate nullification's potential to expedite reform. If repeated acquittals reveal a law's obsolescence or unfairness, legislators may be compelled to review and amend statutes to reflect changing moral consensus. In this sense, conscientious acquittals act as a democratic feedback mechanism, bridging the gap between official rules and lived reality. Potentially reactionary outcomes, however, cultural shifts can cut in multiple directions. Communities that become more socially conservative than their legislative body might acquit defendants who enforce prejudice or take vigilante actions. Thus, nullification also has the potential to anchor the law in outdated moral stances if the local sentiment lags behind progressive legislative reforms. This dual nature underscores the difficulty of celebrating nullification purely as a progressive tool. It remains a morally neutral mechanism, shaped by the community's evolving, but not always enlightened values. The dilemma of obedience versus moral agency. Jury service often thrusts ordinary citizens into an agonizing moral position. On one side is the judge's directive: apply the statute impartially, weigh the evidence, and render a verdict. On the other side is the juror's conscience, which might reject the notion of convicting someone for an act the juror believes should not be criminal in the first place. Internal conflict. Many jurors experience anxiety or guilt when they sense tension between the law as written and justice as they understand it. This emotional turmoil can lead to hung juries or compromise verdicts, where uncertain jurors struggle to reconcile their moral qualms with their legal obligation. In extreme cases, jurors may openly express doubts or refuse to deliberate further, forcing a mistrial. Psychological pressures. The pressure of deciding a person's fate, coupled with the judge's pronouncements, can be overwhelming. Some jurors might want to nullify, but fear going against the grain, especially if fellow jurors strongly endorse strict law enforcement. Others may hope the group will collectively decide to acquit, sparing them from having to rationalize a verdict that feels morally wrong. These complex group dynamics highlight the human dimension of a process that is often seen in purely legal terms. Ethical considerations for judges. Judges occupy a unique role in managing or constraining jury nullification. Their instructions and rulings can either create space for moral reasoning or close that door decisively. Firm instruction to follow the law. Most judges adhere to the standard practice of telling jurors that they must apply the statute and must not let sympathy or prejudice influence the verdict. This stance, while safeguarding uniform enforcement, can suppress moral deliberation among jurors who sense injustice. Subtle cues and judicial restraint. Some judges, albeit rarely, may use neutral or tempered language when summarizing the law, possibly giving observant jurors an opening to apply conscience. This approach can be a quiet acknowledgement of the law's imperfection, allowing room for moral nuance without overtly endorsing nullification. Regardless of their stance, judges must navigate a tightrope. They want to maintain consistency and authority while recognizing that not every case aligns neatly with the letter of the law. Balancing these concerns requires judicial restraint, professionalism, and a keen understanding of the moral dilemmas jurors face. Public perspective, moral imperatives, and societal expectations. From the public's viewpoint, jury nullification often appears as a dramatic act of conscience, an affirmation that ordinary people can stand up to unjust statutes. In communities where mistrust of the justice system runs high, such a stance may be celebrated. In more law and order-oriented circles, however, the same phenomenon can be decried as subversive or chaotic. Media framings, as discussed previously, high-profile acquittals sometimes fuel heated coverage, with headlines leonizing the jurors or condemning them as reckless. Public opinion shifts based on whether the acquittal resonates with dominant moral narratives, protecting a vulnerable defendant, for instance, or contravenes them. Cultural divides. Jury nullification debates often coincide with cultural flashpoints: immigration, drug policy, protest activity, civil disobedience. The moral dimension of these topics can fracture communities. One segment of the public may rally behind jurors who refuse to enforce what they see as an unjust law, while others view the same verdict as destabilizing or dangerous. Here again, the tension plays out in real time, leaving no easy consensus on the proper boundaries of conscience in the courtroom. The future, aligning moral conscience and legal reform. Given these tensions, can law and morality be more seamlessly integrated? While absolute alignment may be impossible, human ethics vary widely. Some measures could reduce the dissonance that spurs drastic jury nullification. Sentencing revisions, scaling back mandatory minimums, and providing more judicial discretion might ease jurors' concerns about excessive punishment, reducing the impetus to nullify. Public input in legislative processes. Encouraging community forums, town halls, and participatory legislative hearings can help laws adapt more quickly to evolving moral standards, making them less likely to appear unjust in the jury room. Transparent education. Some legal scholars advocate for instructing jurors about their power to judge both fact and law, in addition to discussing the risks of arbitrary acquittals. The argument here is that informed jurors are more likely to use conscience responsibly. None of these remedies can entirely resolve the friction between law and morality. However, each step can mitigate it, granting jurors, and by extension, communities, more meaningful input into how statutes are drafted, interpreted, and enforced. The tensions between law and morality are not unique to jury nullification, yet few legal mechanisms reveal them so starkly. On one side, the law aspires to uniformity, predictability, and the rule of established statutes. On the other side, morality demands fidelity to one's conscience and the communal sense of rightness. Jury nullification stands precisely at the fulcrum of these forces, a testament to the fact that legal processes, however orderly and codified, remain woven into the fabric of human judgment and ethical conviction. From the vantage point of broader societal implications, these tensions powerfully shape dialogues about criminal justice reform, community-driven accountability, and evolving cultural norms. By comprehending the historical, philosophical, and practical dimensions of law's uneasy marriage with morality, we gain a clearer perspective on how conscientious acquittals, both revered and reviled, serve as a litmus test for the law's alignment with ethical principles. In the next section, we will shift focus to concrete reform possibilities and future scenarios for jury nullification. The aim is to explore how legislatures, courts, and communities might balance the moral convictions of jurors with a consistent application of law, navigating the path between necessary constraint and vital conscience. Such efforts, however challenging, reflect the enduring quest to ensure that legal institutions and moral truths are not in permanent conflict, but rather in a dialogue that safeguards justice for all. Jury nullification and marginalized communities. In the previous chapter, we explored the broader tensions between law and morality that jury nullification so often brings to the surface. Now we turn to a more specific yet equally consequential facet of those tensions, the ways in which conscientious acquittals intersect with the experiences of marginalized communities. Historically, these communities have been disproportionately affected by oppressive statutes, selective enforcement, and systemic biases within law enforcement and the courts. As a result, the possibility of jury nullification can act both as a shield, when local juries refuse to enforce laws deemed unjustly punitive, and paradoxically, as a weapon, when prejudiced juries nullify statutes designed to protect vulnerable groups. By examining the dual impact of jury nullification on marginalized communities, we gain deeper insight into the intricate relationship between community conscience, legal authority, and social progress. Historical legacies and persistent inequities. Marginalized communities, including racial minorities, immigrants, and other historically oppressed groups, have a complex relationship with jury nullification. On one hand, the doctrine has occasionally served as a powerful instrument for resisting unfair laws. For instance, prior to the Civil War, Northern juries sometimes acquitted those charged under the Fugitive Slave Act, effectively nullifying a statute seen by many as morally abhorrent. These verdicts provided a measure of protection to individuals fleeing enslavement, challenging the federal government's legal framework. On the other hand, the same dynamic facilitated grave injustices during the Jim Crow era, when white jurors routinely refused to convict perpetrators of lynchings and other racial violence against black citizens. In these instances, local prejudices overshadowed legal protections, demonstrating how readily conscientious acquittals can morph into mechanisms of oppression when the community's moral code is steeped in bias. This historical duality remains highly instructive, It underscores that while jury nullification can counteract unjust policies, it can also perpetuate societal inequities if prejudice defines the local standard of justice. Systemic discrimination and selective enforcement. Central to understanding the impact of jury nullification on marginalized communities is the reality that laws are not always enforced uniformly. Systemic discrimination, whether rooted in racism, xenophobia, or class bias, can lead to disproportionately high arrest and prosecution rates in certain neighborhoods. When confronted with these disparities, a local jury might refuse to convict a defendant if they feel the law is being wielded inequitably. In principle, such an acquittal could highlight discriminatory policing or the criminalization of poverty. Indeed, some activists view this response as a grassroots defense against systemic overreach. Yet this ideal scenario presupposes that the jury itself recognizes the discrimination at play. Where local sentiment aligns with that discrimination, nullification can worsen inequities. Rather than acquitting individuals from marginalized groups, a jury tainted by prejudice may convict them harshly, while nullifying charges against individuals from more privileged backgrounds for comparable conduct. In such a setting, the community conscience reinforces existing biases rather than providing a corrective. Hence, the impact of jury nullification on marginalized communities is inextricably linked to the broader environment in which it occurs, shaped by local social attitudes and systemic norms. Protective function, confronting unjust statutes. Despite the risk of perpetuating bias, jury nullification retains the potential to protect those caught in the crosshairs of unjust laws. Across the United States and elsewhere, communities have increasingly questioned the wisdom of criminalizing certain behaviors, especially low-level, nonviolent drug possession or acts tied to immigration status. Marginalized individuals often bear the brunt of these statutes, facing longer or harsher sentences. In cases where jurors perceive a disconnect between the technical violation of the law and actual harm done, they may opt to acquit on moral grounds. This choice can be particularly resonant when the defendant's circumstances reveal systemic failures, for example, the lack of accessible health care, affordable housing, or reasonable pathways to legal residency. In effect, a single nullification verdict can spotlight structural inequalities, urging policymakers to reconsider punitive approaches. It signals that the public conscience, or at least a segment of it, rejects criminalizing survival strategies among disadvantaged populations. Such acts of conscience, while valuable to the defendant in question, can also galvanize broader discussions. Community organizations and legal advocates often leverage these moments to call for legislative reforms, pushing authorities to recognize that a growing portion of the public finds certain laws indefensible. Even if the direct legal impact is limited to a single case, the ripple effects, media coverage, public debate, pressure on legislators, can significantly advance campaigns for decriminalization or restorative justice. Harmful outcomes, undermining civil rights protections. The flip side of this protective function is that when biased or insular communities form the jury, nullification may dismantle statutes explicitly designed to protect marginalized groups. Hate crime legislation, anti-discrimination measures, or laws restricting vigilante behavior can lose their force if local jurors refuse to convict perpetrators whose actions align with community prejudices. Here, conscientious acquittals reflect not empathy for the disadvantaged, but rather hostility or indifference to their well-being. Such outcomes underscore a fundamental tension in jury nullification. It is a neutral tool, wielded by moral judgment that can vary drastically across regions. In areas where marginalized communities already struggle for recognition, juries drawn from a homogeneous or insular population may effectively gut protective legislation. Civil rights advocates express deep concern that promoting nullification too openly could empower those who wish to erode gains made through formal legal reforms. Indeed, each acquittal in a case involving hate-based violence or racial discrimination can erode trust in the very legal system meant to safeguard minority rights. Grassroots advocacy and community education. Against this backdrop, activists who champion marginalized communities frequently see jury nullification as a double-edged sword. Rather than promoting nullification per se, many choose to emphasize broader community education. By shedding light on systemic issues such as mass incarceration or racial profiling, they hope to shape the local moral compass before it enters the jury box. If more citizens understand the underlying causes of social inequality and the disproportionate impact of certain laws on underprivileged groups, they may be less inclined to enforce those laws rigidly and more inclined to consider alternatives like diversion or acquittal. Additionally, grassroots initiatives often integrate jury education into their broader strategies. Instead of telling people outright, "You can nullify," they provide historical context, highlight the stories of individuals harmed by draconian measures, and encourage potential jurors to weigh the real-life consequences of a conviction. This approach avoids running afoul of courtroom rules against explicitly advocating nullification, while still fostering a more empathetic and informed citizenry. By the time these citizens become jurors, they are better equipped to distinguish between laws that genuinely protect public safety and those that function primarily as instruments of social control over marginalized communities. Legislative reevaluation and policy change. Where localized acts of nullification garner significant attention, especially in cases involving defendants from marginalized groups, they can catalyze reevaluation of the underlying legislation. Lawmakers who witness multiple acquittals for the same offense may come to see that continued enforcement lacks public support, at least in certain jurisdictions. This realization can spur policy dialogues, with reform-minded leaders proposing revisions or repeals of outdated or excessively harsh laws. In essence, the friction between moral conscience and legal statutes, exposed by nullification, serves as a flashpoint for legislative innovation. Whether the conversation focuses on eliminating mandatory minimums, rolling back punitive immigration policies, or rethinking the criminalization of homelessness, conscientious acquittals can lend tangible urgency to activist claims that reform is overdue. While the process is far from guaranteed, legislative inertia and political polarization remain strong forces. These high-profile moments in the courtroom can weaken resistance to reevaluating how laws affect historically disadvantaged groups. A path forward, balancing risks and opportunities. For marginalized communities, jury nullification is neither a panacea nor an outright menace. Its success in safeguarding vulnerable defendants hinges on the broader social environment, the attitudes of potential jurors, the role of local media, and the extent of systemic biases within law enforcement and the judiciary. When a community values inclusion and recognizes how certain laws disproportionately harm the disadvantaged, conscientious acquittals become a bulwark against overly punitive statutes. However, where prejudice and fear dominate public sentiment, nullification can undermine civil rights by nullifying critical protections. Navigating these dualities requires a multi-pronged approach. Grassroots education, legal advocacy, and policy reform must go hand in hand. Advocates can work to reshape public opinion by engaging citizens in discussions about systemic inequities, encouraging empathy for defendants' circumstances, and explaining the real impact of laws on oppressed groups. Legislators, in turn, can respond to these shifts in sentiment by crafting more nuanced statutes and reducing reliance on harsh, one-size-fits-all penalties. In this way, jury nullification becomes a last resort mechanism rather than a frequent recourse, a signal that the gap between law and community values remains too wide. In sum, jury nullification's implications for marginalized communities epitomize its broader complexity. It can function as an engine of compassion and reform or as an obstacle to the very protections those communities so urgently need. Much depends on the moral climate in which jurors deliberate, as well as the legislative context that shapes what charges are brought in the first place. By understanding how nullification intersects with systemic discrimination, selective enforcement, and evolving social movements, we see more clearly the stakes involved. The next chapter will continue exploring these broader societal ramifications, focusing on potential reforms that might harmonize conscientious acquittals with the pursuit of justice for all. By examining proposals for sentencing discretion, deeper jury education, and more transparent legal processes, we can better chart a path that respects the moral agency of citizens while safeguarding the rights of marginalized groups. Only then can we reconcile the promise of jury nullification as a tool for good with the sobering reality of its potential misuse.